What's up, everybody? Welcome to Make Things Tiny. My name is Meg. The tiny house movement in the United States started almost 25 years ago, and a lot has changed since then. And lately, it seems like the homes are getting bigger and bigger. But how big is too big, and why does that matter for you? Today, we're talking about whether or not tiny homes are too big. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and make sure you watch the end. I'm going to talk about why the size of the tiny home really does matter. All right, let's get into it. Alright, welcome back. So today we're asking the question, are tiny homes too big? And you might be wondering why. Why does this matter? Why is it important? Well, we're thinking about the entire industry as a whole. So for those of you who are not aware, the tiny house movement, at least here in the United States, it started about 25 years ago. It started when an individual named Jay Schaefer created the first tiny house company, at least here in the US, called Tumbleweed Tiny Homes. I've talked about them in one of the videos earlier on in the channel when I talk about the different tiny house companies that I feel like you should know. But for those of you who are not familiar, Tumbleweed Tiny Homes is credited with being the very first tiny house company in the industry, at least for selling mobile, like movable tiny homes. They started back in 1999. The owner, Jay Schaefer, is considered the founder of the tiny house movement. They started building their own tiny house back in 1997, and believe it or not, it was 89 square feet. You can actually check out a full tour of Jay's very first tiny house on their YouTube channel. But the focus of the movement was on a couple things. It was on sustainability, reducing your carbon footprint, and it was also on affordability and just minimalism in general. So today we're kind of taking a look at the industry, and we're wondering if that's still the case, and if tiny homes are in fact too big, what does that mean for you, for those of you who are considering going tiny and at the different stages in your tiny journey. So Tumbleweed Tiny Homes, we talked a little bit about the company. Their Elm model is actually modeled off the original 89 square foot home, but now that same sort of like model concept, at least, is over 200 square feet, and the starting price is $98,959. We're not going to talk in depth about the cost. I'm going to probably make another video about the cost of tiny homes. I've talked about it a little bit, but yeah, so we've gone from 89 square feet, if we're looking at the industry as a whole, and something they built themselves, so a lot less cost, heavy, to now over 200 square feet and $100K for this model that's modeled off their original house. So it's no secret that the homes are getting more expensive, but they're also getting bigger, which begs the question, what is actually a tiny home? So when we're looking at the industry as a whole, we're seeing rising prices and we're seeing bigger homes, but the definition of a tiny home hasn't changed. So if we're looking at the International Residential Code, this is through the International Code Council, they say that a tiny house is actually a dwelling that's 400 square feet or less in floor area, excluding the loft. So if we're going by the standards from the Elm model, 100%, that's a tiny home. But I wanted to look at what the bigger homes are, because in my opinion, tiny homes keep getting bigger and bigger. So I started with the Orca model through Mint Tiny Homes. For those of you who are not familiar, Mint Tiny Homes is a company based out of Canada. They have a Orca model, which is credited, depending on who you ask or how you search, as being the biggest tiny house in the US. So I checked it out, but it's actually 528 square feet, so it doesn't fit the legal definition, which is probably why they're calling it a park model. It's 44 feet long, but it's coming in at $147,000 for US and $200K for Canadian dollars. So then I was like, all right, well, if that doesn't count as a tiny house, let me go to the other one I know of, which is the Olivia Summit from Tiny Mountain Houses. I did an interview with the owner of Tiny Mountain Houses, Lou, a couple months ago, so you can check that out on the channel as well. But their tiny house, which in my opinion, I'm saying is like the largest one, lengthwise on the market right now, to my knowledge, is 42 feet long, but it's 393 square feet, so it fits our legal definition, and it's a $90K. So that got me thinking, all right, so then what are your options when you're going tiny? If we're looking at these bigger models and we're looking at this price, what are you actually thinking of? What do you consider? So when you're going tiny, for those of you who don't know, you have a couple of options. You can either buy land and put your tiny home there, which is what Tiffany did on the channel. I had an interview with Tiffany in Florida, bought land, put their own tiny home there. You can buy land and you can DIY your tiny home build. You can put a tiny house in your backyard. You can put a tiny house in your friend or your family member's backyard, or you can put a tiny house in the tiny house community or an RV park, depending on whether or not the RV park allows tiny homes. So those are some of the things that you have to think about when you're considering going tiny. Where you're going to put it is huge. I harp on that. Builders harp on that. But those are your different options. So I was thinking, all right, well, if these are the options people have to go tiny, the thing I haven't really talked about, but I've noticed some of you mentioning in the comments, is land. So my thoughts were, all right, these are the things you need to think about before you're going tiny. If we're talking about land in particular, because I know that's really important to some of you, if you can buy land, then it's important that you should, right? So for those of you who are curious about the land side of tiny homes, I would say if you can buy land right now, then definitely buy land. But the question becomes, do you go tiny before you buy the land? Do you buy the land and then build your own tiny house? And then what do you do if you can't buy land? But I put that land is king because a lot is changing in the housing market. So for those of you who haven't been paying attention to the larger housing market, the cost of everything is going up. Land's going up, housing's going up, tiny houses are going up. So my recommendation, or at least the way I'm trying to think about this myself, is that it's really, really important for people to buy land right now because that's the one thing that we can't get more of. So if you are thinking about buying a tiny house or land, I think it makes more sense to buy the land first and then the tiny house, because you can always buy a tiny house, but land is kind of scarce. All right, so if we're thinking that, if we're going, okay, let's buy land, that's what we're thinking about, I wanted to think about the tiny houses that we have right now in the market that are bigger, the ones that are more expensive, and whether or not it makes sense for you to buy land somewhere in that price range or below, or just buy the house outright and then figure it out as you go. So I thought of Texas because Texas is relatively inexpensive depending on your price point for homes, as a lot of the South is compared to the East and the West Coast in the United States. But there's a lot of counties, or there's a few counties in Texas where tiny homes are more, I guess it's more tiny house friendly. You have a couple of tiny house communities. I've had a couple of them on the channel here too. So I was thinking, okay, well, if I want to look at Texas, let's assume that we have $100,000 in our budget because we're thinking about the tiny houses that are bigger. What can we get for that price point in terms of land? So we can, in fact, get land in Texas for under $100,000. So I started in San Antonio, and this is what I have, the results from Zillow. Tons of options for housing and land. This is a mix of housing and land. So then I was like, all right, let me zoom in to a rural area because from what I understand, more rural areas have more favorable zoning laws potentially in rural areas. So I zoomed into a rural area a little bit north of San Antonio, Texas. So still staying in a major city, and there's still land options there. There's still housing options there within that 100K price point. So this is what I found. I found that you could get, a little bit under half an acre for like $50,000 to $60,000. That still gives you money to play around with if you want to build your own tiny house. So for those of you who are watching that are thinking, I want to go tiny and there's no way I can do it in a way where I still have land because that's important to you, you have an option here in Texas at least. I'll expand outside of Texas later on in the video and talk a little bit about how it might vary. But for those of you who are curious about going tiny, you want land and you want everything to be affordable, you could go to Texas, right outside of San Antonio, if you're cool with that area, and you could get land for about 50 or 60K, plenty of space for you to put your tiny home on, and then you would have to build it yourself though, right? It's unlikely you'd be able to get the land, get it developed and built, and then buy a 100K tiny home. But if you can do that and that works in your budget, you want to stretch it, then you have that option too. So, and then I was like, okay, what about houses? Because I know that if you buy land with a structure on it, it makes it easier for you because it's already connected to all the different utilities and things like that you would need, like septic, that sort of thing. So there are options under 100K in this area as well too. Let's see, of the ones I've found, I feel like some of them look like you might just tear down the house. So maybe you're still paying 60 or 70K for land, but then it's still connected. So there's an option there. But I also found an entire house for 100K. It looks kind of like you might have to tear it down and renovate it, but you still have all that space behind it where you could put a tiny house there too. And then it's up to you whether or not you want to live in the tiny house and rent out the big house. You want to rent out the big house, live in that sort of thing. It just depends on what you're interested in and what your financial goals are, but it's possible. So that begs the question is just how important it is for you to think about what is the best way for you to go tiny. So far on the channel, I've focused a lot on just giving you access to as many builders as possible, different tiny house communities, that sort of thing. But I also think it's really important for you to think before you even get to the builders, before you even get to the communities, just what's the best way for you to go tiny in general. And I think sometimes we can get a little too distracted by the availability of the homes themselves. And I want to make sure that you all take the time to think about what the best way is for you to go tiny and when, because it might make more sense for you to actually just buy land. So we're back at the question, are tiny homes too big? I think it depends, right? So if you're looking at the movement as a whole, look at the entire tiny house industry and the movement, at least here in the United States, maybe in Canada too, but I'm in the US, so I'll only speak to the US. I would say yes, because we're a far cry away from 89 square feet and thinking about sustainability and affordability. Like so many of you have pointed out, tiny homes are not affordable for a lot of people. Sustainability to me means the ability to continue to do something, like the literal definition, but also environmental sustainability too. And I don't really know enough about the environmental sustainability side of it, but in terms of people's ability to be able to live in tiny homes and do them long term, it depends on who you ask, right? For some people, it's really hard to find a place to stay with their tiny home. For some people, the RV parks they go to, they get, bought up by developers and then they get removed. Tiny house communities, things can change. So it depends on who you ask there. I would say just in general, probably not. As I mentioned before, as the housing industry changes, it affects the tiny house industry. So as long as houses are as big as they are, tiny homes are always going to be considered kind of small. But then again, for those of you that are living in certain areas, like if a 600 square foot home, legally it's not a tiny house. And for some of you, a 600 square feet is just a house. It's just an apartment. It's just a condo, that sort of thing. So I would say it depends on what aspects of either the movement you're looking at or the housing industry. But why I'm telling you this is because I want you to, more than anything, to consider why you're going tiny. I don't think it makes sense to go tiny just because it's kind of trendy right now. It's a lot of time, it's a lot of money, and it can become a pretty complicated thing to be involved in if you don't do the research beforehand to make sure that you can legally put it where you want to put it, that you can build it in your backyard with all the different zoning and different things like that, depending on where you live. The other thing is I want you to consider the best way to go tiny, because there is more than one way. Sometimes you're only shown like one way through like social media or different things like that, but there's a lot of different ways to go tiny. It looks different for everyone. And then the most important thing is to consider cost and the sizing too. Depending on what you're looking at, if you want something bigger, it might make more sense just to go with one of the builders if you have 100K to spend. But if you're willing to compromise on a few square feet, it might make sense for you to do the DIY route. Because then maybe the cost that you're sort of building up, or what it looks like when you go 2 square feet over or something like that, is a little bit different. But ultimately, the sort of like the main takeaway is bigger doesn't mean better. It often means more money in the tiny house industry, which, because we're thinking about, the different prices and depending on where you live. So bigger doesn't always mean better. So it's just a matter of thinking about whether or not you really do need a 40-foot tiny home, and if you do, whether or not it's worth it for you to pay for it. Because you're definitely gonna pay for it if you don't build it yourself. Okay, the other thing is that it matters where you live. This is kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about, because I think it's really important when you're thinking about the tiny house industry and the movement in general. There are certain places in the US that are better than others, and I've had people ask me about this, like what makes the most sense, or I want to go tiny. For the most part, it depends on where you live. So if you're in the South, I would say I put the South as the top, because I think a lot is happening in the South. A lot is shifting in the housing market. A lot of people are moving to the South, which is raising the prices of housing. But the South overall still remains pretty affordable in terms of land and even housing, depending on where you live. But the other side of it is that there's a lot of movement in the industry in the South. So a lot of you watching may be aware of like North Carolina is becoming kind of like I don't know if it's a hub, but it's increasing in terms of popularity for tiny homes. I think parts of South Carolina too. I know Tennessee is a popular one as well. So the South could be a great place for those of you who, if you're willing to move and you want to get something that's more affordable and you're interested in land, I would say the South might make sense. If you're willing to move, the Midwest could be a potential option. I grew up in the Midwest. It's really beautiful, but it's also pretty affordable too. So, maybe there's parts of the Midwest that could appeal to you. I will say that there's not as many tiny house communities in the Midwest, so you might be living in an RV park. For the West Coast, it just depends, right? The West Coast is so expensive. I'm not going to sugarcoat that for you all. So if you're not on the West Coast, you're gonna get a little bit of sticker shock when it comes to moving to the West Coast, because the price of land is really expensive, the price of houses are really expensive, so then the price of tiny homes are pretty pricey too, depending on where you're looking. And then the East Coast is a bit of a wild card. I've seen some communities on the East Coast. I've seen some more affordable options on the East Coast. I've seen more expensive options on the East Coast. So the main takeaway from this conversation about where you live is to think of the price of the land, the price of the tiny homes, and the price of the tiny house communities. and you have to consider whether or not those things match up with what you're interested in and what you need. But I want to know what you think. So in general, do you think tiny homes are too big? How do you feel about the language around tiny homes? I know I've talked about that a lot, but people are calling things tiny homes that technically aren't them, right? Legally are not them. You can refer back to the park model versus tiny homes video with Jody from Phoenix Park Models back from like a week or so ago, where they talk about the difference between the two. So that's a great one to check out as well if you haven't seen it. But yeah, in general, I just want to know what you all think. What are your plans? What do you think about going tiny? How do you feel about the movement and the industry as a whole? As always, I appreciate you all so much for watching. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Don't forget to think tiny.